was. I know, I was on like another level. Like, were you guys not?
Wait a minute. Who was it? Oh, Rachel asks you every 5 minutes to do the running man.
Yes. Oh God, wait, when? I don't know, I don't remember that. Oh God. Okay, so you were doing too.
What?
You were doing.
I just feel so bad for Christian.
You felt bad for him?
I was like, Christian, could you get my wallet? He opens my bag, my bra's just chilling there. I'm like,
He was like, why are you guys showing each other through? Weirdos.
I go, Rachel, can I see it? Bobby goes, can I see it too? I'm like, no.
I don't know what happened there.
Everyone started taking them and I was like,
Yeah, I wouldn't take off. Is it already on?
I'm pretty sure we get on that later.
It's alright, it's just YouTube. Nobody can figure it out. It's totally just hard to make future 5 years.
How are you feeling? About what?
About what?
Yeah, I realized that. Okay, why don't we get started? It's going to be a long, relatively long lecture, I think, depending on how fast we get through. So this is a talk devoted entirely to one nerve, the trigeminal nerve, which is a very large and sort of complicated nerve that does a lot of things in the face. It does a lot of sensory innervation to a lot of the tissues in the face. It does as well some motor innervation to a group of masticatory or chewing muscles that we'll talk about as well. And then there's also a bunch of other fibers running with it. So even though the trigeminal nerve is sort of intrinsically a somatosensory and a somatomotor nerve, it does have pre- and post-ganglionic parasympathetic fibers running with it from other cranial nerves. It has sympathetic nerves, post-ganglionic, sympathetic nerves, all post-ganglionic in the head, by the way. And it also has some special sensory taste fibers from the facial nerve, which Dr. Wilberg will talk about more on Wednesday. And there's some visceral sensory fibers here too, but I'm not really going to talk about that at all today. So here it is, so you can just memorize this and we don't have to do this talk. But I wouldn't really recommend that. I'm going to try to compartmentalize it for you. But it's called the trigeminal nerve because Gemini is twin, and it's the 3 twins. So these 3 big nerves we're going to talk about sort of as separate chapters of the trigeminal nerve. So it comes from the brain, like all cranial nerves. It spreads out into this big, what's called trigeminal, or sometimes called semilunar ganglion, which contains sensory cell bodies. And from there it splits, it trifurcates into these big divisions, this ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular divisions. If you look at the placement of the trigeminal nerve in the cranial base, which we will soon, next week maybe, it rests right here in the middle cranial fossa. And so if you look at this with the soft tissue intact, you'll see something like this. Right there in the middle cranial fossa, in the cavernous sinus, you'll have the trigeminal ganglion, this swollen part right here, and then it'll split into 3 divisions, which we call V1, V2, and V3. V1 exiting through the superior orbital fissure, V2 through the foramen rotundum, that hole in the greater wing of the sphenoid, and V3 through the foramen ovale down here. And so here we see it again sort of ghosted on the face here. And so V1 is going to go towards the superior part of the face and is entirely a sensory nerve. Okay, so V1 is entirely sensory in nature to the dura, the skin, and epithelial tissues of the superior face. V2 is again entirely sensory in nature and will do somatosensory to the mid-face essentially. We'll define this better in a little bit. And finally, the mandibular division, V3, is a larger nerve that has sensory and motor components. Again, to 4 muscles of mastication and a bunch of other muscles that we'll talk about one by one. Okay, and so here overlaid is sort of their general territories on the face. So the ophthalmic division up here, maxillary at the midface, and finally the mandibular division lower down towards the jaw. And here it is superimposed with other nerves that we've already learned about, spinal nerves from the cervical plexus of nerves and some dorsal rami we've dissected previously. So posterior, we have spinal nerve innervation here on the scalp and posterior lateral parts of the neck. But on the face, it's all trigeminal nerve, V1, V2, V3. Okay. So we begin by talking about just V1. So we're going to start with V1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of guide you through a schematic pathway, sort of like it's easy to get lost in the details and all the terminal twigs of these nerves, but I like to think of it as like in a more schematic type of way, like a subway map. So we're going to use this key to guide us through this. We're green. Anytime you see green, those are going to be sensory fibers. Blue is motor, so we won't see that till the end in the mandibular nerve. Purple is parasympathetic, red sympathetic, then yellow is this special sensory. And then ganglia, we have some ganglia here, 4 parasympathetic ganglia in the head, which are all related to the trigeminal nerve in some way. Those will be purple, and then the sympathetic is this, for whatever reason, that's a red smiley face. And I have to, before I go on, I have to credit this handsome gentleman right here, Josh, who's a second-year medical student who created all of these for the summer anatomy class, and I've definitely stolen it for this. But, so here is sort of the overview of V1 in a schematized form, and we're going to construct this sort of piece by piece. So we're gonna end up with this sort of big roadmap of this nerve, but right now we're just going to start with the basics. So the nerve, as I said, stems from the trigeminal ganglion in the cavernous sinus, and then we'll go through the superior orbital fissure, where it'll immediately split into 3 branches, okay? So from medial to lateral here, here's more medial towards the top of the screen. The nasociliary nerve, a sensory nerve. These are all sensory nerves right now. Frontal nerve in the middle, and the lacrimal nerve going most lateral, okay? And after that, the frontal nerve, as it approaches the orbit, will split into a supratrochlear nerve and a supraorbital nerve. And perhaps you've already seen this in lab on Friday. The supraorbital nerve will exit through the supraorbital foramen or the supraorbital notch, and that'll be lateral, always be lateral to the supratrochlear nerve. These are going to the scalp, okay? Off the nasociliary nerve, you get these long ciliary nerves that go provide sensory to the iris and the cornea. And then you're going to get these short ciliary nerves to the sclera, or the white of the eye. And those are going to be passing through one of the 4 parasympathetic ganglia in the head. The first one we become acquainted with, called the ciliary ganglion. Okay, and because it's parasympathetic, obviously these sensory nerves are just passing through and not synapsing or communicating with this ganglion. However, there is preganglionic, the solid purple is preganglionic parasympathetics from a different cranial nerve, the oculomotor nerve, which go and communicate with the ciliary ganglion. And then postganglionics, this dotted line right here, will run to the eyeball with the short ciliary nerve. And this is sort of the theme with the trigeminal nerve. Although it's not inherently parasympathetic, it provides a pathway for parasympathetic nerves to travel along with it. So if we look at a short ciliary nerve, it will contain sensory from the trigeminal nerve and parasympathetics from the oculomotor nerve. Okay? Sympathetics, like I said, in the sympathetic chain, they're preganglionic, but they all synapse at this big ganglion that you've probably seen in lab already, called the superior cervical ganglion. It was visible deep in the root of the neck. And then you get postganglionic sympathetics that will travel into the head, and in the case of V1, ride with the long ciliary nerves. So long ciliary nerves are transmitting sensory nerves from V1, but also postganglionic sympathetics that were coming all the way back from the superior cervical ganglion. These are going to the eye again. Some more twigs off of the nasociliary nerve are these ethmoidal branches, okay, these posterior and anterior ethmoidal nerves, which will innervate spaces in the midface, essentially these ethmoid air cells. Finally, this will terminate on the face as an infratrochlear nerve, which I'll show you in a different picture on the face. And then the lacrimal nerve will have, as well, will have parasympathetics running. So the lacrimal gland is a gland. It requires parasympathetic innervation. And that will come from the pterygopalatine ganglion, which is in the pterygopalatine fossa, so that's lower down here. And those parasympathetics will run with the lacrimal nerve. So again, the lacrimal nerve from V1 is not intrinsically parasympathetic, but these parasympathetic nerves hitchhike with it to innervate the lacrimal gland to produce tears. Okay, so that is the completed pathway for V1. Sensory, and then with some parasympathetics running with it, some from the oculomotor nerve and some from the facial nerve here. Okay? And so what this actually looks like on the face, you'll see here, this region with these nerves, we have innervation basically from the upper eyelid and superiorly into the forehead and scalp, and the medial part of the nose, also part of the dura, et cetera, et cetera. So you can go through this on your own time. But here you can see the supratrochlear nerve medial to the supraorbital nerve. Hopefully you've seen this on Friday. If not, definitely see it by today. We may be able to see a superior palpebral nerve exiting via the orbit over the upper eyelid there, terminating there. And then more medial towards the sort of junction of the orbit and the nose, you should find an infratrochlear nerve. And then further down on the nose, an external nasal nerve as well. So here they are sort of all in association with each other. So all these up here are branches, superficial branches from V1. Okay? And so here's sort of how it looks like in not such a schematized form, so this is a more true to life picture. So again, you have V1 will go through the superior orbital fissure and divide into a frontal nerve, a nasociliary nerve, more medially, and a lacrimal nerve right here towards the lacrimal gland. And then each of those nerves will give off their own little pieces. So the frontal nerve breaks up into those two nerves towards the scalp, et cetera, et cetera. This communicating branch to the zygomatic nerve, that's where the parasympathetics are coming from, the pterygopalatine ganglion from lower down to be relayed to this gland. Thank you. And then here, this little blob right here is going to be the ciliary ganglion, so one of those parasympathetic ganglia of the head. And you can see that the long ciliary nerves sort of come from the nasociliary nerve and go to the posterior aspect of the eyeball, whereas the short ciliary ganglia, nerves emerge from the ciliary ganglia, the shorter, that's where they get their name from. These are carrying sensory and parasympathetic. These are carrying sensory and sympathetic. Okay? So this is V1, V1's territory up here. So V2, in the midface, again, we're going to sort of go through its pathway. A little more complicated, this nerve, as you can see. But again, we'll begin with just the sensory components of this nerve, the parts that are intrinsic to it. So V2 will exit through the foramen rotundum in the sphenoid bone, and then send a big branch sensory branch to the zygomatic and midface, which is actually just the zygomatic nerve, but will then split into these two nerves, the zygomaticofacial and zygomaticotemporal nerves. But its sort of main continuation is this big nerve called the infraorbital nerve, which is sort of traveling in between sort of the floor of the orbit / roof of the maxilla. And so that's going to go through the inferior orbital fissure after that, and then give rise to a bunch of these nerves to the teeth, which I'll talk about in detail in a minute, but it's a collection of superior alveolar nerves to the maxillary dentition. Finally, the infraorbital nerve will exit through the infraorbital foramen and become, well, you'll see it on the face as a big bundle in the midface. Another branch is this nasopalatine nerve, which is sort of not going through this ganglion, but sort of nearby. And that'll split off into a bunch of septal nasal branches, which again I'll show you in detail in a minute. You also have in and around, so this region is obviously the pterygopalatine fossa. You'll have some nerves to the hard and soft palate going through there. The lesser palatine nerve will go posterior to the soft palate. The greater palatine nerve towards the hard palate. And the nasopalatine nerve will actually go through this canal, the incisive canal, to exit just posterior to the medial incisors, and I'll show you that in a minute. This ganglion, the pterygopalatine ganglion, communicates with the greater petrosal nerve, which is from cranial nerve 7, which Dr. Wilbur would talk about more tomorrow, but I just show it here because, again, like all of the other parasympathetic ganglia in the head, they're all suspended in some way by branches of the trigeminal nerve. So they're all connected to the trigeminal nerve. In this case, these little twigs from V2 suspend the pterygopalatine ganglion. And so you have preganglionics running in the greater petrosal nerve. We'll go through the pterygoid canal and then synapse here at this ganglion. Postganglionics will emerge from that and go to that lacrimal gland, which I showed you on the V1 section. So that's how the postganglionics from the pterygopalatine ganglion reach the lacrimal gland through these communicating branches with